Archdeacon Ben Scott. William has said a good bit about him. He was, but Ben, two of his daughters are here, and his wife Sally is here with us today. And maybe his daughters would want to say something about Ben, because I know that children often have insights into their parents' strengths, and if there happen to be any weaknesses that the rest of us don't have. But Ben was an archdeacon in the Diocese of Minnesota for many years. I don't know how many years, and I'm not sure exactly what his geographical responsibilities were. But an archdeacon is a deacon who is more arch than the rest of us, and sort of a sub-bishop, I think. I'm not really clear, but whether the archdeacon's job is to protect the clergy from the bishop or to protect the bishops from his clergy. But he did that well for many years, and in the course of that became a student and an expert on the history of our diocese with native people in Minnesota. And that's what he's going to talk about a bit today. And the reason why we were eager to ask him to come is because that history, of course, continues today, but under considerably changed circumstances as regards both native people and non-native people. And that'll be probably what we're talking about next week, after Ben lays the groundwork for us with a little history and reflection of his own today. So Ben, take it away.
Oh, you're on mute.
Who?
Ben.
Oh, Ben, you're on mute. Oh dear.
We need Sal. We need our mom to unmute him.
Mary and Rachel, fill in the meantime. Tell us about Ben.
Oh, Rachel is literally running next door. This is hilarious. So they are on a family farm that's been in Dad's side of the family for over 150 years. And there's two little homes on the property, and my sister Rachel lives in one and my folks live in the other. They're literally about 5 feet apart, corner to corner. So she can get up and literally run to the next house to unmute. So there she is, love it. So the only thing I would say, we love him dearly. One thing I will share is Rachel and I were often the subject of many a sermon, unbeknownst to us until we were sitting in the pew. So that was our experience being preacher's kids. There they are.
We did it! Yay!
I'm unmuted.
And here is Ben Scott.
Well, here I am. Yes.
Exactly.
Thank
Take it
you.
away, Dad.
Well, you've been introduced, so take it away.
Well, again, thanks, Tony. And thank you for the invitation to tell stories about the mission of Episcopalians in Minnesota among the Dakota and the Ojibwe. Episcopalians have a distinguished history of missionaries and of mission endeavors among the indigenous people in the lakes and forests and the prairies that became the Diocese of Minnesota. And they are stories that Episcopalians should hear and should treasure and tell in these challenging times of systemic racial turmoil. They are stories of heroic witness to the way of love in Jesus Christ, as well as stories of Episcopalian participation in Native removal and genocide. But before I begin, I want to say two things. First of all, my blessing on the continuing journey of companionship in mission and ministry between St. Luke's and St. James. I did serve on the staff of the diocese as archdeacon in southern Minnesota, Tony, for 10 years, walking with several congregations that were facing similar circumstances as St. James has faced, and the various options that were facing their futures. Among them, at St. James, its relationship with St. Luke's. And so at this point in their history, both congregations have my blessing. During the sadness a changing community has in sacred place, and in the hopes and dreams of what those decisions might mean for both the congregations in the years to come. And second, I want to say thank you from both Sally and me for the spiritual nurturing of the Nice family and the Scott Hovland family during their years with the St. Luke's community, St. James community. That you get it mixed up. The way of love has deeply touched our family. Thank you. Now, to the storytelling. The July 12th issue of the biweekly Episcopalian publication, The Living Church, printed an article with the title, Twin Challenges for Minnesota's New Bishop. In the article, Kirk Peterson asked Bishop Loya, quote, "Could you say more about the church's complicity in systemic racism? What form has it taken?" End of quote. In his reply, Bishop Loya asserted, quote, "I think early in the church's history in this country, we oftentimes were complicit in the decimation of indigenous cultures with sort of a thin veneer of gospel witness and evangelism layered over the top of that. Our own structures, our own leadership, our own makeup at different times has privileged people who are white over Black, brown, and indigenous people," end of quote. The article identifies an urgent summons for Episcopalians at the beginning of Bishop Loya's new ministry in Minnesota to act on systemic racism. I'll tell stories about 4 missionaries in Minnesota, 3 of whom are celebrated in the Episcopal Church through our liturgical calendar: Jackson Kemper, James Lloyd Breck, and John Johnson Mnangagwa. The 4th, Henry Benjamin Whipple, became Minnesota's first Episcopal bishop, serving the church for 42 years. They are all male clergy of the 19th century whose work was bound tightly in the faith community with other deacons, priests, and bishops, along with lay women and lay men in what was called in our diocese the Indian Mission. And I'll start with Jackson Kemper. He began his priestly ministry in the white upper-class congregation of Christ Church, Philadelphia, under the American Episcopal Church's prominent leader after the Revolution, William White. As our first missionary bishop, Kemper was compelled for a mission among Native peoples in his Northwest Territory. It began with his contact with the Oneida, who had been removed from New York to Wisconsin. And so he made his home and mission center at Nashotah, near Milwaukee, inviting 3 general seminary graduates to found a religious community in order to do missionary work on the Wisconsin frontier. They were James Lloyd Breck, William Adams, and John Henry Hobart Jr., the son of the Bishop of New York. These 3 founded a community of religious brethren called Nashotah House. They built a mission center on Nashotah Lake and began an Anglo-Catholic ministry among the white and the indigenous peoples of eastern Wisconsin. During the 10 years of Breck's leadership at Nashotah, he kept looking west across the Mississippi River to the Indian territory that was being ceded by the Dakota and the Ojibwe through treaties with the federal government for white settlement. In 1850, Breck turned in his keys to Nashotah, walked across Wisconsin to La Crosse with a deacon and a lay student, celebrated the Eucharist on a rock on Grandad Bluff overlooking the Mississippi River and the Minnesota territory on the western side, boarded a river steamer to St. Paul, pitched a tent, and began the mission of the Episcopal Church in Minnesota among both white settlers and the indigenous peoples. He called it Christ Church St. Paul. On the east side of the river were gatherings of Episcopalians at Stillwater and at St. Anthony Falls, all of them under the Episcopal direction of Bishop Kemper and the pastoral care of Ezekiel Geer, chaplain at Fort Snelling. St. Paul in those days was a village of 1,600 surly frontiersmen and rum runners. Breck was restless. His heart was among the Ojibwe and the Dakota. A Methodist interpreter in the French fur trade named Emnagabo, an Adawa from Canada, heard of Breck's interest in mission and conveyed to Breck the interest of Chief Hole in the Day at Gull Lake to begin a mission among the Ojibwe. Breck responded yes to Emnagabo, walked from St. Paul to Brainerd twice that summer, all dressed up in his habit of cassock and squash hat, and in 1852 founded St. Columba's Gull Lake with a church building and a mission house for a team of lay and ordained missionaries. Episcopal services were in Ojibwe and in English, sensitive to the native culture and religion, and there was schooling for both boys and girls, schooling in white ways. Among the team members was a young woman whose name was Miss Jane Maria Mills. Breck fell in love, and they were married at Fort Snelling to the utter dismay of those back at Neshota. Emnagabo continued at the very core of St. Columba's after he was relieved of his deacon's ordination in the Methodist Church. Soon, troubles began at St. Columba's as the military was being withdrawn from Fort Ripley to serve in the Union Army, approaching civil war. The Ojibwe were fully aware of the war threat voiced by the Dakota over broken treaties with the United States government. And rum was devastating the young Ojibwe near Fort Ripley, and the assaults against the whites at the mission became intolerable. A midnight flight left Emnagabo in charge at St. Columba's. Breck and the mission team sought a new location for the mission of Episcopalians in Minnesota, and down at Faribault, Breck found the crossroad of the Dakota and the Ojibwe fur traders, as well as white settlers eager to turn an agricultural profit from the vast prairie land ceded by the Dakota. Alexander Faribault, a French Roman Catholic fur trader, offered Breck both land and money. Now, missionaries always respond to both land and money. Faribault became the new associate mission with a church building and a mission house. The mission school for both boys and girls, white, Dakota, and Ojibwe, brought hundreds to the baptismal font, to the Christian faith, and to the way of the white culture. Jesus Christ and civilization went hand in hand at the Episcopal Church's Indian Mission in Minnesota, as well as all across the country where the church and the federal government shared together the terms of implementing the treaties. From the Indian point of view, church and state were simply one entity of white dominance, violent, brutal, and distrustful. The Dakota-United States War was devastating to all the indigenous people in Minnesota and to the Christian mission of Episcopalians in both northern and southern Minnesota. At the same time in our history, the railroads and the wheat fields were shifting the demographics of Minnesota away from the mines and forests in the north and the vast expanse of agricultural development in the south, shifting it to Minneapolis and the gigantic enterprise at St. Anthony Falls. Cultural, religious, economic, ethnic, and racial diversity were leaving the Dakota and the Ojibwe people isolated on their reservations, abandoned in economic and cultural poverty, and systemic racism. The heroic mission of Kemper, Breck, Emnagabo, and the outstanding teams of men and women lay and ordained, sustaining bilingual congregations all across Minnesota, were little by little systemically cast aside by Minnesota Episcopalians. The recent shattering of monuments to Andrew Jackson and Christopher Columbus in this country testify to the intense racism among whites in Minnesota's history with its indigenous peoples. Let me go back to stories about Breck, Whipple, and Emnagabo. Breck's associate mission at Faribault blossomed. Classes, begun at the parish of the Good Shepherd in 1858, began with 167 boys and girls, white, Dakota, and Ojibwe. In 4 years, there were 35 families and 100 in the Sunday school. In 5 years, there were 400 adults listed in that parish, 110 baptisms, and 3 Sunday schools. After the election and consecration of Minnesota's first bishop, Henry Benjamin Whipple, he toured around in his new diocese. He was so impressed with Breck's mission that he chose Faribault as the see city and laid the cornerstone for the American Episcopal Church's first cathedral in 1862 as war with the Dakota loomed nearby in the coming fall. With Breck's associate mission now located in Faribault, Bishop Kemper ordained Emnagabo deacon for St. Columba's mission in 1859. And in 1867, Bishop Whipple ordained him priest, the first native priest in the American church, the ordination taking place in the partially finished cathedral building. Emnagabo had continued St. Columba's mission with both Ojibwe and white families, building tiny log cabins for all of them, planting gardens beside them. Women were sewing and scrubbing, children were reading, services were in English and in Ojibwe. Then came the 1862 war. Chief Hole in the Day and Chief Little Crow on the Dakota side conspired to attack whites in both the north at Fort Ripley and in the south at the Lower Agency. Emnagabo learned of the conspiracy at St. Columba's. He did 3 things. First, he sent messengers to Fort Ripley with a warning. Secondly, he sent messengers to Mille Lacs to recruit warriors to protect the white settlers. Third, he saved his own family by loading his wife and children into a canoe, pulling it on the Gull River to the fort. 2 of the children died in that journey of exposure. When he returned to St. Columba's, he found it had been totally destroyed and its gardens trampled down. He took his native and white mission villagers up to Crow Wing, where he conducted services in both languages and acted in order to provide some compensation as interpreter in both Minnesota and in Washington. Then one more tragedy, the removal. The Ojibwe were separated from the white community and marched by the military to the White Earth Reservation. At St. Columba's at White Earth, he then built a magnificent stone Gothic church building and trained young Ojibwe men for ordination. At his death in 1902, he had buried his wife, Charlotte, of 50 years, and all 12 of their children. His grave site at White Earth was authorized and paid for by Congress. Now back to the Dakota War. It lasted 6 weeks, ending at Camp Release in September 1862. That fall, all Dakota in Minnesota were incarcerated at Fort Snelling. Those warriors who were identified by White for war crimes were tried in 10-minute trials, interpreted by the Protestant missionaries from the upper agency. 303 were condemned to death by hanging. Bishop Whipple interceded the sentence with President Lincoln, who reduced the execution to 38. On the day after Christmas, 1862, they were hanged at Mankato with one pull of the rope. When the winter ice was out of the Mississippi River, the Fort Snelling encampment was emptied onto river steamers. The entire Dakota Nation was expelled from Minnesota by law to go to St. Louis by boat, to the Missouri River by boxcar, by boat to Crow Creek, where there was neither food, clothing, nor shelter. Hundreds died, most of them children. With them went the mission priest from the lower agency, the Reverend Samuel Hinman, his wife and children, and Miss Emily West, the teacher at the mission school. Hinman had endured the incarceration at Fort Snelling and prepared many for baptism and confirmation by Bishop Whipple. After a troublesome relationship with the bishop appointed by the House of Bishops to oversee the Niobrara non-geographical jurisdiction, and the death of his wife following a tornado, Reverend Hinman returned to the lower agency as the guest of Chief Goodthunder, and he is buried there beside St. Cornelia's Mission Church. Some of the lower Sioux were able to return to their homeland eventually in Minnesota and to recover their ancestral heritage. Episcopalians continue to value our spiritual relationship with these Dakota people. Now to Henry Benjamin Whipple, Episcopalians' first diocesan bishop and probably the best known prelate in the public's eye. The federal building at the foot of the Mendota Bridge across the Mississippi is named for him. And currently, ironically, it houses the ICE offices and courtrooms. He is regarded as a Native American advocate and is called straight tongue by the Dakota and the Ojibwe. It means he did not speak with a false tongue. He was the Bishop of Minnesota for 42 years, married to his childhood sweetheart, Cornelia, who raised with him 6 children. She died following a train derailment in Georgia, returning from their winter home in Florida. He was 72 when he married Evangeline Simpson in New York City. She was a very rich widow, 36 years old, and the loving companion of Rose Cleveland, the sister of President Grover Cleveland, and host at the White House prior to the president's marriage. Evangelist and her dearest bishop, had a deeply affectionate relationship until his death in Faribault at 1902. She funded significant Indian missions. She funded St. Mary's Hall, the girls' boarding school at Faribault, and they traveled at her expense among the aristocracy in Europe and in Scotland, and were received by Queen Victoria when the bishop was honored with an honorary doctorate at the University of Oxford. The widowed Evangeline and Rose lived their final years in Tuscany, Italy, and were buried together in a cemetery located on the Via Whipple. Henry Benjamin Whipple is a man of all seasons and a man of his time. His descendants are still with us and among us here in Minnesota. His sarcophagus lies beneath the high altar at his Faribault Cathedral, and the carillon of bells in the Memorial Cathedral Tower are Evangeline's gift to Episcopalians in Minnesota. Cornelia's memorial statue is in a niche above the north portal at St. Mark's Cathedral, and she holds in her hand a prayer book and a broom, Ora et Labora. Her loving bishop and husband is in a niche in the reredos of the National Cathedral in Washington. And so Episcopalians in Minnesota have very deep roots in the Dakota community, in the Ojibwe Nation, and in the historic traditions of the white Episcopal Church, a unique heritage that we must treasure. Why is that? Henry Whipple grew up in Adams, New York, Oneida County, the homeland of the Oneida people before their removal to eastern Wisconsin. He and Cornelia grew up knowing Oneida, who had returned to New York. Whipple was raised a revivalist Presbyterian, Cornelia an Episcopalian. But Whipple learned the prayer book by reading to his blind grandmother. The family were liberal evangelical Protestants, involved in abolitionist circles, the Underground Railroad, and women's education and legal rights. But he was subject to some kind of periodic ailment that required extensive traveling. I wish I had that doctor. He traveled on his own at his doctor's expense to the antebellum South, to the Near East, to Europe, and to the lakes and forests of the Ojibwe, and across the prairies of the Dakota. The bishop and his carriage, drawn by Bashaw, his horse, were a legend everywhere in Minnesota before there were railroads. He avoided the high church versus low church divide in the 19th century Episcopalian Church, defining his diocese as a mission church. He never wore a cope and mitre. And so I'll finish my Whipple story with the other side. Whipple approved of the reservation system adopted by the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. He signed the federal documents releasing the Black Hills as a Dakota sacred land, releasing it for white land appropriation. He supported the Indian schools, which enforced brutally acculturation of Native children to white ways. His Native companions were men and women who had left the indigenous way and adopted the white way and the way of Jesus Christ. And so to conclude this morning's forum, I'll go back to Bishop Loya's interview with Kirk Peterson, reported in the Living Church publication. He asked our bishop how he might spend the money from the church's executive council in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder that happened just a few days before his consecration. This is our bishop's reply. This has been a reminder to the Episcopal Church and to the disciples of Jesus Christ everywhere that this is long work. We are called to repenting, accounting, reconciling with our own history of being complicit in systemic racism. We hope to set up that work of racial justice and reconciliation for the long term. Our story of the Episcopal Church in Minnesota is now turning a new chapter in the way of love. So thank you, and I'll take Q&A. And we'll do this with the little boxes, so everybody needs to unmute.
Unmute yourselves as you want to.
All is silence. Are we praying? We need lots of prayers.
Hey, Ben, this is Larry. This is just, this isn't really a question, but you were obviously reading from a text. That would be,
Yes.
if you're willing to share that, it'd be wonderful to have that.
Well, yes, I'll do a little editing and punctuation and looking up some of the facts, but and who should I send it to, Larry?
I would really value having that, and I think others would as well. Thank
Okay,
you.
I'll put it in, print it on paper and send it to you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like it too.
Yeah, I think a lot of us.
Well, but you can do whatever you want to
Yeah,
with
right.
it. It's not copyrighted.
Well, yeah, it is.
Yes, Gretchen.
I just wanted to thank you. I think a lot of people don't know all of these things, and there are other things as well about the state, which obviously aren't part of your stories of the Episcopal Church, but it is very important that we know this about ourselves, that we know of the amazingly good things that we did with Native Americans, and that we were complicit in some of the really really terrible things that happened to the Native Americans.
Well, I think that it's I could tell so many stories.
I know.
One of the things that I think is important is that the Episcopal Church in its beginnings started with its Native American interest for mission, because we were part of the British Empire, which had the Church of England stationed throughout its empire. And so we couldn't have missions, in Australia and in Canada and other places. So the Episcopal Church, particularly after the Revolution, looked to the native peoples as a place for missionary endeavor. And so we joined the Roman Catholic missionaries, who mostly were French Jesuits during the time that Minnesota was part of New France, and the Protestant missionaries in both the Dakota and the Ojibwe, who were sent out by the American, I've forgotten, it was a large ecumenical Protestant evangelical mission group that sent first many Protestant evangelical missionaries to Minnesota, primarily to the Dakota at the Upper Agency.
Mm-hmm.
So we were part of a larger mission field of Christian endeavor involved in the complicit destruction of native ways.
Ben, Tony Morley here.
Yes.
I have the impression from somewhere, I don't know where, and I don't have any idea whether it's accurate or not, that there was some kind of a division of territory, or division of spoils, or division conversion prospects between Roman Catholics and Episcopalians in the territory of Minnesota?
Oh, yes. Yes. The missionaries came with the fur traders, and they were very respectful and honored the native ways. Their center was at Collegeville with the Benedictine Abbey, and in the Ojibwe territory. Their missionaries were primarily individual missionary priests. Father Hennepin, Father Marquette, all of those who came as individual missionaries, while the Episcopalians came as a community, a mission community, with both ordained and lay men and women involved in the mission as a mission team. The Protestants came with both men and women also, but with their evangelical culture, that with the image of transforming the native peoples into middle class, upper Protestant Christians from New England.
Yeah.
Ben, I have a question. This is, hi, Susan Moss.
Hello, Susan.
Hey, so what I'm always been interested in is what's the primary motivation of a missionary in these days? Is it the saving of souls? Is it like what you just mentioned, conversion to white man's universe? What do you think was what motivated a man like Breck and even Whipple? What was their one and two primary motivations for coming into working with Indigenous people?
Their primary motivation was dual, I think. One of them is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, and with fervor and conviction. The other dimension to that was civilizing the native peoples. You have to remember that they came at a time when colored people were regarded as inferior. Neither of the nations had any written language, and so they were required to speak English because their native languages were inferior. They had ceremonies which were pagan. Their their family life, for instance, was in some respects polygamous, and particularly among the Protestant missionaries, monogamy was required, and so the wives and children were discarded, literally to starve to death outside the community. So there were some cultural dimensions to these two degrees that I think need to have a new chapter turned over them. Does that make sense, Susan?
Yeah,
What we must learn from our relationships with the Indigenous communities, not only in Minnesota, but everywhere throughout our nation, is to listen.
So a quick follow-up question. What can you tell us about why Indigenous people came towards, for example, the mission in Faribault?
I missed some of that, Susan.
Why did Indigenous people come towards those that did? Why did they come towards the missionaries in these times?
I can only speak. Let me use the example of Chief Little Crow at the Lower Sioux Agency. On the day that the United States Dakota War began, Little Crow went to the Episcopal service of Samuel Hinman as the young warriors were beginning to gather in council to make the decision for whether or not to declare war. From the Episcopal service, he walked down to the to the circle of warriors in council, and realized that the warriors were going to declare the war because they had not received from the federal government the terms of the treaty. They had moved onto the reservation lands, but they had not been received the things that the treaty provided. And they debated, and they decided to declare war. And Chief Little Crow listened to them. They listened to him because Little Crow knew the disaster that was impending on a military engagement with the United States government. And but he followed their footsteps. And as he left the council meeting, the first shots were fired at the lower agency, killing the Indian agent. Does that help to understand a little bit about the dimension of the work of the missionaries? Those Dakota who are in photographs with, if you notice them, with Bishop Whipple and Cornelia and others who were on that mission, are men who have their hair cut, who are wearing pants and coats and top hats. They are acculturated to white ways and therefore followed in the steps of Bishop Whipple.
And
there are no pictures of the other kind. The dominant culture transmits the history.
a really important and very readable book. Anton Troyer, who is probably a writer that's familiar to many of you, wrote a book called Hole in the Day. Ben made reference to Chief Hole in the Day.
Yes.
It's a very readable book, and I would highly recommend it for much more of the detail on that. But that's
Right.
that's an incredibly
my primary resource book for this point of history is called 400 Years of Anglican Episcopal Mission among the Indigenous People. It's by Oana Anderson, and it's published by Forward Movement Publications.
Ruth Ann,
She is a
can you
very,
say the book you mentioned?
very skilled writer and a very deep scholar.
Well, Ben, I think we are all much in your debt for this presentation, and
Thank you.
much challenged to continue the conversation among ourselves in the coming week and weeks, because the history that you have opened up to us leaves massive questions for our present day relationship and with Native people and their relationship with our mostly white church.
And our bishop is calling us to a long work.
Yes, good for him. Good for him. So thank you again. And William,
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
we're up against our closing time, so that's why I'm intervening here. William, you want to close us out, or Larry?
Larry?
Here, let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this time together. We give you thanks for allowing us to hear and listen to stories that we may not have heard before, to learn from them and to change our hearts. We ask this all through Christ our Lord. Amen.
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 Go in peace and see you very soon, I hope, each and every one of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, how do I turn it off?
Thank you, Ben.
You can get rid of it, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
Don't worry about it.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Beth. Yes, thank you very much.
All right. See you later.
Bye.
See you later.